The ER doors burst open at 11:47 p.m., and the first thing everyone saw was the blood. It covered the soldier from collar to waist, dark, soaked through, the kind of bleeding that meant the clock was already running. Paramedics were shouting vitals. Nurses scrambled for a gurney, and then the screaming started. Not from the patient, but from the staff, because behind the stretcher, a 90-pound Belgian Malinois had locked onto the gurney rail with its teeth and was not letting go. Security reached for tasers. A doctor yelled to call animal control. In 15 seconds, the whole emergency room had turned into a standoff. Nobody moved toward the dog, except one nurse. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where I want you. Follow my channel all the way to the end, and when you're done, drop a like and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The shift had been grinding for 6 hours before any of it happened. Marisol Vega had been on her feet since 5 in the afternoon, and by the time the clock crawled past 11, she was running on cold coffee and muscle memory. Cascade Ridge Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Dunmore, Washington. Not a small hospital, not a prestigious one, just the kind of place that stayed perpetually understaffed and overworked, where the hallways smelled like floor cleaner and the vending machines were always out of the good options. Marisol was 28 years old. On paper, she was a level 2 trauma nurse, just under 2 years out of her probationary period. To most of the senior staff, she was still the new one, the quiet one who came from nowhere in particular, kept her head down, and did her job without making a fuss. People liked her fine, they just didn't think much about her. That was exactly the way she'd wanted it. What they didn't know, what she had never told anyone in this building, was that she had spent 4 years before nursing school as a combat medic with the 75th Ranger Regiment. She had served 2 deployments. She had kept men alive in conditions that most of the physicians at Cascade Ridge couldn't imagine. She had learned to work fast, work quiet, and make decisions in environments where hesitating for 5 seconds could mean a body bag instead of a stretcher. She left the Army for reasons she didn't talk about. She built a new life. She took the nursing boards, accepted the entry-level position, and let people underestimate her, because being underestimated meant being left alone to do the work. Tonight, the work had been manageable. 2 car accident victims, 1 pediatric fever that turned out to be nothing serious, a diabetic episode, and a man in his 70s who kept apologizing for the trouble. Marisol had handled all 3 without drama and was updating her last chart at the nurse's station when the radio at the ambulance bay crackled. She almost didn't register it. Dispatch calls ran in the background constantly, but something in the cadence made her stop typing. Adult male, approximate age 30, multiple lacerations, suspected internal trauma, unstable BP, incoming from Route 9 corridor, civilian transport, not EMS. ETA, 4 minutes. Civilian transport. That was strange. EMS didn't hand off like that. She was already moving toward the ambulance bay when the second detail came through. Be advised, there is a working dog with the patient. Dog is not secured. Repeat. The animal is not in a crate and is not leashed. Bucky, the charge nurse, Donna Hecht, heard that from across the station. What? She grabbed the radio handset. Dispatch, please confirm. Unrestrained animal incoming to our ER bay. Confirmed. The individual transporting the patient states the animal will not separate from him. Donna turned to the nearest orderly. Call security, now. Marisol was already pulling gloves from the wall dispenser. The vehicle that came through wasn't an ambulance. It was a dark green pickup truck, mud-caked up to the door panels, driving too fast and braking too hard in the ambulance lane. The driver, a man in his 40s with a military-style buzz cut and a flannel shirt, was out of the cab before the engine died. He yanked open the back door, and that was when Marisol got her first look at the patient. He was tall, lean, built like someone who had spent a long time carrying weight across difficult ground. His clothes were shredded at the torso, the fabric dark and wet. He was unconscious or close to it, his head lolled against the seat, his breathing visible but labored. And pressed against him, chest to chest, forepaws hooked over his shoulder, was the dog. The Malinois was in full alert posture, ears up, eyes scanning, muscles rigid under short fawn fur. It wasn't growling, it wasn't snapping, it was simply fixed. watching everything, cataloging everything, not moving 1 centimeter away from its handler. The driver was already talking, fast and low. He took it in the side. I don't know how deep. He wouldn't let me pull up the shirt to check. I got him here as fast as I could. The dog won't. You have to understand, the dog won't leave him. You try to pull them apart, the dog will react. 2 nurses and an orderly had come out behind Marisol. She heard one of them, Trevor, a big guy who'd been in the ER for 6 years and was afraid of approximately nothing. Step back. That animal needs to be removed, Donna said from the doorway. Ma'am, I'm telling you, sit. I don't care what you're telling me. We cannot bring an unrestrained animal into this facility. Someone call. I'll handle the dog. Marisol said it quietly, but she said it with the kind of flat certainty that cut through the noise. Donna looked at her. Excuse me? I said I'll handle the dog. Get a gurney out here. He's losing time. She didn't wait for permission. She moved around the stretcher team, past the driver, and stopped about 4 feet from the open truck door. The Malinois tracked her immediately. Its eyes locked on her, shouted. Intelligent, focused, not panicked. That told her something. A panicked dog would be different. This animal was working. She let herself go still. Not the stillness of someone who was scared and not moving. The operational stillness, posture neutral, hands low, weight balanced. She'd been around enough working dogs during her time in the regiment to know the difference between aggression and protection, and she knew how handlers communicated with their animals when they needed them to hold. She kept her voice low and even. Fuss, she said. Heel, the standard German command used by most military K9 handlers. The dog's ears shifted. It looked at her differently, not as a threat, but as something it was suddenly unsure about. Hier, bleib. Here, stay. The Malinois made a sound in its throat, not a growl, something closer to a question. Bleib, she repeated, and she moved 1 step closer and extended her hand, palm down. The dog dropped its nose to her hand and inhaled for 2 full seconds. Then it stepped back inside the truck, still positioned against its handler's side, but its posture had shifted. Less rigid, less braced. It was still watching. It was not attacking. Get him out, Marisol said over her shoulder. It'll let you now. Keep the dog in your sight line and move slow. It wasn't seamless. The driver was nervous. One of the nurses moved too fast and the Malinois tensed again, and Marisol had to put herself between the dog and the nurse and say, Ruhig, quiet, before the moment passed. But they got the patient onto the gurney. They got him through the bay doors, and the dog moved alongside the gurney, not dragging anyone, not lunging, simply walking in step, pressed close to its handler's reaching arm. They made it as far as the trauma hallway before the wall came up. The wall's name was Director Gordon Pruitt. He was a heavy-set man in his late 50s, with the kind of face that had settled permanently into an expression of controlled displeasure. He ran the administrative side of Cascade Ridge the way someone runs a business they don't particularly like but intend to milk for everything it's worth. He was not a physician. He had never been a physician. He had a hospital administration degree from a mid-tier university and a very expensive suit, and he had arrived in the ER bay within 4 minutes of being notified, which meant someone had called him the moment the truck pulled up. He looked at the dog. He looked at Marisol. He looked at the patient on the gurney. And then he looked past all of them, the way people do when they've already made up their mind. Stop, he said. Nobody stopped. I said stop. His voice went up. That animal does not enter this building. Get it out. Get it contained or euthanized. I don't care which, but it is not coming past this point. The driver from the truck was still inside. Sir, that dog is a military, but I am not interested in what that dog is. I am interested in the liability exposure of an unrestrained animal in this emergency department, and I'm telling you right now, the dog isn't the problem, Marisol said. Pruitt turned to her. He looked at her the way senior people look at junior people when they've said something irritating. And you are? Vega, trauma nursing, level 2. She kept her voice level. The dog is a military working animal. He's in protection mode because his handler is injured and unconscious. He hasn't bitten anyone. He's not going to. He's doing exactly what he's trained to do. That's a very interesting theory. It's not a theory. Nurse Vega. Donna stepped in. her voice a careful warning. Director Pruitt has authority over... The patient is crashing, Marisol said. She wasn't raising her voice. She didn't need to. I can see it from here. If we spend another 4 minutes arguing about the dog, this man dies in the hallway. Is that what we're doing? Pruitt's jaw tightened. He pointed at the Malinois. Remove it. If you remove the dog by force, it will fight you. Someone gets hurt, and you have a bigger liability problem than the one you're trying to avoid. She looked him in the eye. I can manage the dog. Let me do that while the team works on the patient. That's the solution. There was a beat of silence. Then Pruitt said, You don't have the authority to make that call. Neither do you. When a patient's life is at immediate risk, that's the medical team's call. She turned to the attending physician, Dr. Raymond Ochoa, who had been standing 6 feet back and saying nothing. Dr. Ochoa, patient status? Ochoa looked at the monitor a nurse had just clipped to the patient's finger. His expression shifted. BP's 64 over 40. He's going into shock. He looked at Pruitt, then back at the gurney. We need to move. The dog, Pruitt said. I'll take responsibility for the dog, Marisol said. Ochoa made his decision in about 1.5 seconds, the way good trauma physicians do. Move, he said to his team. Trauma Bay 2. They moved. Pruitt didn't stop them. He stood in the hallway with his arms at his sides, watching, and the look on his face was the look of someone who was already building the case for what came next. The Malinois stayed close to the gurney all the way into the trauma bay. When the team started cutting away the patient's shirt and attaching monitors and calling out numbers, the dog pressed itself into the corner of the room, watching but not interfering. Marisol crouched beside it, one hand resting lightly on its flank, saying almost nothing, just keeping her presence there, constant and calm, so the animal knew someone it had decided to trust was still in the room. She got her first real look at the patient while the team worked. He was roughly her age, maybe a few years older. The injuries on his torso were not clean. They looked like something that had happened at speed, in the dark, on rough terrain. There was a deep laceration across his left side that had gone through muscle. There were older marks, too, scars that didn't come from any accident. His hands, she noticed, were the hands of someone who worked with them in serious ways, calloused differently than a laborer, the knuckles marked in specific places. She looked at the dog. Military working dog. German commands, which meant the handler had likely been trained in a program that used German for K9 commands. The dog had not left him. Not for a moment. She looked at the driver who had followed them into the bay and was standing near the door, watching with an expression that was held very carefully together. He had the same quality as the patient, someone who had learned to manage what showed on his face. Who is he? She asked, keeping her voice under the noise of the team working. The driver looked at her. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. His name is Marcus, he said finally. That's all I can tell you. She didn't push it. She'd known people who carried answers like that, held tight, not for deception but for reasons that mattered. The next 40 minutes were hard. Marcus, whoever Marcus was, had lost significant blood. The laceration went deeper than the initial assessment, and Ochoa made a call to get him into surgery that Marisol agreed with before he'd finished the sentence. The problem was the dog. No one on the surgical team was going to operate with a Malinois in the room. Marisol understood that, and she also understood that the moment Marcus was moved out of the dog's sightline, the animal was going to try to follow. She worked with the dog for 8 minutes, pulling on every piece of K9 handling knowledge she'd built during her years in the regiment. It wasn't clean. The dog fought her twice, surging toward the doors when the gurney was rolled out, and she had to physically block it while using a command she'd heard a handler use once for holding position under extreme stress, a hard, clipped, higher halt in braver Hund. Here, hold, good dog. The third word was deliberate. Reward language even in the worst moment, the way good handlers did it. The dog held. It pressed against her leg and shook, and she put her hand on the back of its neck and stayed there while the team took Marcus to surgery, and she felt the animal's distress like something physical. This animal loved that man with the specific intensity that working dogs carry for their handlers, and being separated from him cost the dog something real. I know, she said quietly. He's okay. They're taking care of him. The dog looked at the door. He's okay. she said again. By the time the crisis stabilized enough for Marisol to step back into the hallway, Gordon Pruitt was waiting. He had 2 security personnel with him and Donna Hecht at his shoulder, and the clipboard in his hand had papers on it that were already filled out. He had been efficient about it. She had to give him that. Nurse Vega. His voice was pleasant in the way that cold things are. I need you to hand over your badge and come with me. She looked at the clipboard. She could read enough of the form from 6 feet away to know what it was. You're terminating me. I'm initiating a formal separation due to insubordination and willful violation of facility safety protocols. Yes. The patient is alive. That's not in question. I handled the dog without incident. No one was hurt. You chose to override the direct instruction of hospital administration during an active safety situation. Pruitt's voice stayed pleasant. That's not judgment I'm interested in on this team, regardless of the outcome. Donna looked at the floor. At least she had the decency to do that. Marisol considered the situation. She could fight it here, in this hallway, tonight. And she'd lose, because Pruitt had the paperwork and the authority and the institutional backing. Or she could go. She had done her job. Marcus was in surgery. The dog was contained and calm. The outcome was the right one. She unclipped her badge. She set it on top of Pruitt's clipboard. For what it's worth, she said, if I'd followed your instruction, he would have died in the hallway. Pruitt said nothing. She picked up her bag from the nurse's locker room and she walked out through the ER bay doors alone, into a night that was cold and wet, the parking lot lights turning the rain into thin silver lines. She sat in her car for a while, not crying, just sitting with the particular weight of having done the exactly right thing and been punished for it anyway, which was a feeling she'd had before, though not quite like this. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it, then answered. There was a pause on the line, not the mechanical pause of a spam call, but the deliberate pause of someone deciding how to begin. Is this Marisol Vega? The voice was male, calm, and carried the flat, precise quality of someone who gave briefings for a living. Who's asking? Another pause. My name isn't important right now. What's important is that the man your hospital just sent to surgery is not who they think he is, and the people who are coming to find him are going to have questions about what happened to the nurse who kept his dog calm. A beat. Don't go far, Ms. Vega. The call ended. She sat very still in the dark car, rain drumming on the roof, and looked at the screen until it went black. She stayed in the car for 11 minutes. She counted them, not because she was waiting for something specific, but because getting out of the car meant deciding what to do next, and she wasn't ready to decide yet. The rain kept coming. The hospital's lights reflected off the wet asphalt in long, distorted streaks. Through the ER bay window, she could see the silhouette of people moving. Nurses, orderlies, the ordinary machinery of an emergency department rolling on without her. The call had lasted 43 seconds. She'd already replayed it 4 times in her head. The man your hospital just sent to surgery is not who they think he is. She thought about the scars, the way Marcus's hands looked, the dog's behavior. Not feral, not undertrained, but disciplined in the specific way that military working animals were disciplined, which took years in particular handlers, and the kind of bond that didn't come from weekend obedience classes. She thought about the driver who'd said, "That's all I can tell you," with the calm of someone who'd been briefed on exactly how much to say. She thought about the dog still inside, probably pressed against the nearest wall to the surgical wing, waiting. She got out of the car. She didn't go back through the ER bay. Pruitt would have someone watching for that. Instead, she walked around to the east entrance, the one the housekeeping staff used after hours, where the badge reader had been broken for 6 weeks and maintenance kept filing the repair ticket and it kept getting deprioritized. She knew about it because she'd propped that door open herself twice during long shifts when she needed air and didn't want to walk all the way around the building. The door opened. She slipped inside. The surgical wing was 2 floors up. She took the stairs. She found the dog exactly where she'd expected. In the small family waiting alcove off the surgical corridor, wedged into the corner behind a row of plastic chairs, positioned so it had a sight line to the surgical suite doors. Someone had put a paper cup of water near it. The dog hadn't touched the water. It looked up when she came around the corner, and the shift in its posture was immediate. Not relief exactly, because dogs didn't do relief the way people imagined, but a recalibration, a lowering of the sustained alarm. It recognized her as the thing that had stayed calm when everything else hadn't. She sat on the floor next to it, not on the plastic chairs, on the floor, cross-legged, at the dog's level. "Hey," she said low. "Still here." The dog put its nose against her knee and left it there. She stayed like that for a while, listening to the sounds of the building around her. The hum of the ventilation system, a distant intercom, footsteps on tiles somewhere below. Her termination paperwork was probably already in the system. By morning, her badge access would be formally revoked, her schedule wiped, her locker cleared if Donna followed standard procedure. 2 years of building something in this place, slow and deliberate, keeping her head down, doing the work. And Pruitt had ended it in under 10 minutes because she'd made him feel overridden. She'd known men like him before, not in hospitals. In the other world, the one she'd left. Men who prioritized the appearance of control over the reality of outcomes, who treated every challenge to their authority as a personal attack regardless of whether lives were at stake. She'd learned, in that other world, that there was no point arguing with them in the moment. The argument always came later, and it came through other channels. She just hadn't expected to be having that lesson again in a surgical waiting alcove in Dunmore, Washington, at 1 a.m, sitting on the floor next to a military dog who missed his handler. The footsteps she'd been half listening to got louder. Then they stopped. She looked up. The man standing at the edge of the alcove was not a doctor. He was not a nurse or an orderly or a security guard. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark jeans, a gray jacket, but he stood the way people stood when they'd spent a long time in environments where how you positioned yourself relative to exits and angles mattered. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and eyes that were doing a very fast, very thorough job of assessing her and the dog and the space. He looked at the dog first. Something moved across his face, the controlled version of relief that people allow themselves when they've been afraid of a specific outcome and it hasn't happened. Then he looked at her. "You're the nurse." "Former nurse, as of about an hour ago." She kept her voice even. "You're not a visitor." "No." He came closer, not fast, keeping his movements visible. The dog tracked him, but didn't tense. That was information. The dog knew him, or knew his type, and had categorized him as not a threat. "My name is Darren Schultz. I work with the man in surgery." "Work with him how?" It wasn't quite a question. He heard that. In ways I'm not going to explain in a hospital hallway. He crouched down so he wasn't standing over her, which she noted as a deliberate choice. "But I'm going to tell you that what you did tonight, with the dog, with the whole situation, that was the right call, every part of it." The hospital disagrees. The hospital's director is an idiot who's never been in a situation where a bad decision got somebody killed. He said it flatly, without heat. "That's a separate problem." She looked at him steadily. "You were the one who called me." A pause. "Yes." "How did you get my number?" "Ms. Vega." He said her name like he'd known it for longer than tonight. "We knew about the incoming situation before the truck pulled into your bay. We've been monitoring his location since things went sideways. We just couldn't get a team here fast enough." He glanced at the surgical suite doors. "How bad is it?" "Deep laceration, left side, significant blood loss, shock on arrival." "Dr. Ochoa's good. If the patient doesn't have complications, His name isn't Marcus." She let that sit for a second. "Okay." "His name is Theo Rask. He's a chief warrant officer." Schultz's jaw shifted slightly. "And the reason the hospital hasn't been told that yet is because the people who did this to him may not know he made it to a hospital. We'd like to keep that window as long as possible." Something clicked into place. Not everything, not even most of it, but enough that she understood why the dog hadn't been released, why the driver had given her a first name only, why Schultz had called her instead of walking in through the front door. "You're worried about exposure," she said. "I'm worried about a lot of things. Right now, the most immediate one is that your hospital director is going to call animal control and whatever passes for a security escalation in this place, and that's going to create noise we can't afford." He looked at the dog again. "Axios won't go easily." I know. She put her hand back on the dog's flank. Axios. Now she had a name for that too. I can manage him. I've been doing it. I see that. Something in Schultz's expression shifted. Not warmth exactly, but a kind of recalibration similar to what the dog had done earlier. That's why I called you. We ran your name through the facility database when the situation started. Your profile said level 2 trauma nurse, 2 years post-probationary. But the way you handled Axios... He stopped. Where did you learn those commands? It was the question she'd been waiting for since she'd said fuss in the ambulance bay. I had some training, she said. That's not a 75th Ranger level of some training. The air in the alcove changed slightly. She kept her face still. You ran my civilian profile, she said. I did. Apparently not the other one. Schultz was quiet for a moment. Then, what other one? She looked at him. She'd spent 4 years building a wall between who she'd been and who she was now. And it had served her well. And she was very aware that the next thing she said would start dismantling part of it. But she was also sitting on a hospital floor at 1 a.m, fired, with a military dog pressed against her leg, and a man in front of her who already knew more about her than her coworkers did, and the math wasn't complicated. Vega, Marisol A, she said. Sergeant, 75th Ranger Regiment, combat medic, 2 deployments, separated honorably. She met his eyes. That other one. Schultz held very still. Then he said, That's not in the system I accessed. I requested restricted status when I separated. It's there. You just need a different clearance level to see it. She paused. Which apparently you have, but you didn't pull it. He exhaled slowly through his nose. It was the first truly unguarded thing he'd done since he walked in. Well, he said after a moment, that explains the dog. Before she could respond, Axios lifted his head sharply. His ears went up and rotated back, not toward the surgical suite doors, but toward the corridor behind Schultz. A low sound started in the dog's chest. Schultz was on his feet before the sound finished. 3 seconds later, Gordon Pruitt came around the corner with 2 security guards and a woman Marisol didn't recognize. Civilian clothes, older, carrying a tablet like it was a weapon. Pruitt saw Marisol first, and his expression went from controlled displeasure to something sharper. She's trespassing. She was terminated and escorted off the premises. He pointed at the guards. Remove her. Hold on, Schultz said. Pruitt looked at him. And who are you? Darren Schultz. He didn't produce a badge. He didn't reach for anything. He just stood there, and something about the way he was standing made the guards hesitate in a way they probably couldn't have explained. I'm with a federal agency that has an active interest in the patient currently in your OR. I need everyone to take a breath before this situation gets complicated. I don't care who you're with, Pruitt said. This woman was terminated for cause, she's violated facility entry protocols, and that animal is an unlicensed... The animal is a certified military working dog operating under federal protection guidelines. Schultz's voice hadn't changed in pitch or speed. It was the same measured, unhurried tone he'd been using since he walked in. Interfering with him constitutes a federal offense under Title 18, and the patient in your OR is an active-duty federal operator, which means this facility and its staff are now operating under a set of obligations that supersede your internal policy on a few things. The woman with the tablet typed something. I want documentation, Pruitt said, but some of the certainty had gone out of it. You'll have it. Schultz glanced at Marisol. Ms. Vega, would you stay with Axios? It wasn't quite a question either. Yes, she said. Pruitt turned on her. She is not employed by this facility. She has no right. She's a consultant, Schultz said. Effective as of this conversation. The word landed in the room like something solid. Pruitt opened his mouth, closed it, looked at the guards. The guards looked at the woman with the tablet, who had stopped typing and was looking at Pruitt with the patient expression of someone waiting for a specific bad decision so she could document it. Pruitt made a sound that was not quite a word. Then he said, This is not over. No, Schultz agreed pleasantly. It isn't. Pruitt left. The guards left. The woman with the tablet did not leave. She moved to the far end of the alcove and stood with her back to the wall, still typing. Marisol looked at Schultz. Consultant, she said. Best I could do on short notice. A very slight thing happened at the corner of his mouth. It's not technically inaccurate. What agency? Later. That's the second time you've said later. And both times I meant it. He checked his watch. Right now I need to make some calls. I need you to stay with Axios and tell me the moment there's any update from the OR. I was just fired. I know. I snuck back in through a broken door. I know that too. She looked at him for a moment. Axios was still pressed against her leg, his earlier alarm having settled back to watchful patience after Pruitt's group left. Okay, she said, but I want answers, real ones. Not later, not when it's convenient. Real answers, in actual sentences. Schultz looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite categorize. Not quite impressed, not quite amused, something in between that she suspected didn't land on his face very often. Fair, he said. And then he walked to the far end of the corridor, pulled out a phone, and started making calls in a voice too low to hear. The next 2 hours moved strangely. Slow in some stretches, then suddenly, not slow at all. Marisol stayed on the floor of the alcove with Axios and ran through what she knew, which wasn't much, and what she suspected, which was more. Theo Rask, Chief Warrant Officer. Injuries that looked operational rather than accidental. A handler dog trained to German commands, disciplined enough to hold position under extreme stress. A civilian driver who knew exactly how much not to say. Schultz, who'd appeared within an hour of the situation and had federal authority he was comfortable using without showing documentation. She'd known men like Rask. She'd treated men like Rask. The 75th had worked alongside specialized units she'd never been formally told the names of, and she'd patched up people from those units without asking questions, because the questions weren't hers to ask. She understood the architecture of that world. The layered compartmentalization, the civilian cover. The way things that happened in it didn't make it into databases that hospital administrators could access. What she didn't understand was why it had ended with Rask being transported by a civilian in a muddy pickup truck instead of by a military medical unit, and why Schultz had arrived alone instead of with a team, and why the woman with the tablet was the only other person she'd seen. The woman with the tablet had introduced herself, eventually, as Harriet She had said it with the particular economy of someone who was giving Marisol the minimum required information and no more. What do you do? Marisol had asked. Documentation, Harriet had said. For who? For the record. That was all she'd gotten. At 3:14 in the morning, the surgical suite doors opened and Dr. Ochoa came out with the particular walk of a surgeon who has finished a long procedure and is not finished with the night yet. He stopped when he saw Marisol. The expression on his face was complicated. You're not supposed to be here, he said. I know. He looked at the dog, at Harriet, across the alcove, then back at Marisol. He was a good physician, Ochoa. Not warm, not the kind who sat with families and held their hands, but technically excellent and unafraid of hard situations. He'd made the right call in the hallway when Pruitt was pushing him toward the wrong one, and she respected that. He made it through, Ochoa said. He'll need another procedure in 48 hours, depending on how the tissue responds, but he's stable. He paused. Who is he? I can't answer that, Marisol said. Ochoa looked at her steadily. The injury pattern, the physical condition, the dog. He stopped. I've been doing trauma for 19 years. I know what civilians look like when they come in, and I know what they don't look like. He's going to need monitoring through the night, she said. Good monitoring, someone who's paying attention. I'm aware of what my patient needs, Vega. I know you are. She met his eyes. I'm asking you to be the one who does it personally, not a resident. Something shifted in his expression, a very small nod. He'll be in Recovery Bay 1. I'll be on until 6. He glanced at the dog one more time. The animal shouldn't be in the Recovery Bay. Hospital liability. I know, she said. I'll keep him here. Ochoa left. Schultz reappeared from the corridor end 12 minutes later. He moved differently than when he'd left. More contained, which she'd learned to read as a sign that something had changed. What happened? She said. He sat down. Not on the floor, but in one of the plastic chairs, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. For the first time, he looked tired. Not overwhelmed, just tired. The specific kind that came from running hard for too long. The situation that put Rask in that truck, he said slowly, didn't end when he got here. She waited. There were two of them, Rask and his partner. Schultz stopped. Started again. His partner didn't make it. Rask and Axios walked out, literally walked, 7 miles of rough terrain before they got to a road. He exhaled. The driver who brought them in was a retired Marine. Rask flagged him down. The man didn't ask questions, just drove. 7 miles. With that laceration, with blood loss. She didn't say anything about that because there wasn't anything useful to say. The people responsible, she said. They don't know he's here. As of 2 hours ago, no. That may have changed. He looked at her directly. Which means this hospital may not be as quiet as it needs to be for much longer. She absorbed that. What does that mean, practically? She said. It means I need to move him. But I can't move him yet because Ochoa's right. Moving him in the next 6 hours could kill him. He ran a hand across the back of his neck. So we're in a window, and in that window I need people in this building that I trust. She looked at the surgical suite doors. Through them, somewhere in the recovery bay, was a man who had walked 7 miles in the dark, bleeding from a wound that would have put most people on the ground in the first mile, who'd flagged down a stranger on a road and trusted that stranger to make the right call. And the dog, Axios, had stayed with him every step of those 7 miles and every moment since. She thought about what Pruitt had said. You chose an animal over hospital policy. As if those were the only two options, as if that was the actual thing that had happened. You need me to stay, she said. I can't ask you to do that. You've already lost your job over this. You called me a consultant. That doesn't... Schultz. She said his name the way you said someone's name when you wanted them to stop backfilling. I'm not going anywhere. Tell me what you need. He looked at her for a long moment. Axios had shifted in his sleep. He'd finally gone down about 30 minutes ago, head on his forepaws, one ear still half raised, and in the fluorescent quiet of the waiting alcove, with the hospital moving on its nocturnal rhythms around them, Schultz looked like someone adding up numbers and getting an answer he hadn't expected. There's a man coming, he said finally. He'll be here by 5. I need you to make sure no one in this building does anything to complicate Rask's condition before he arrives. A pause. And I need Axios ready to travel. Who's coming? She said. Schultz opened his mouth. His phone buzzed before he could answer. He looked at the screen. Something happened in his expression, fast, controlled, but she caught it. What? She said. He stood up. We may have less than 5 hours, he said. Why? He turned the phone so she could see the screen. It was a text message, 4 words, no sender name visible. They know he survived. Marisol read the 4 words twice, then looked up at Schultz. How long do we actually have? She said. I don't know. That message came from someone inside the network who has better information than I do right now, which means I can't verify timeline. He was already moving toward the corridor. It could be 2 hours, it could be less. Moving Rask before the 6-hour mark is a serious risk. Ochoa said, I know what Ochoa said. He turned back. I'm not going to move him unless I have no choice, but I need to know what that choice looks like before I have to make it. He held her gaze. Can you get me his current vitals without going through the charge desk? She thought about it. Recovery Bay 1. Ochoa had said he'd be there personally until 6. If she went through the surgical corridor instead of the nursing station, she could get eyes on Rask's monitors without triggering a flag in the system that no longer recognized her badge, which meant she'd have to get through a door that required one. I need 10 minutes, she said. You have 5. She was already moving. The surgical corridor access required a badge, but the door that connected it to the imaging wing didn't. Imaging ran 24 hours, and the door between them stayed on a manual latch after 11 p.m. to allow for equipment transfers without waking the badge reader. She'd learned that in her first month, the kind of institutional knowledge that accrued when you paid attention to how a building actually functioned versus how its policy manual said it did. She went through imaging, past the dark MRI suite, through the connecting door, and into the post-surgical recovery wing. The lighting was dim to night levels, the monitors casting blue-white light across the curtained bays. A single nurse sat at the station at the far end, Priya, who worked nights and was meticulous and quiet, and was currently writing in a paper chart with her back to the corridor. Marisol moved to Bay 1. Rask lay flat, intubated, with 3 monitors running and 2 drips. One she recognized as a volume expander, one as a broad-spectrum antibiotic. His color was still bad, but less bad than the ambulance bay, which was something. Heart rate in the low 80s, blood pressure hovering at a marginal but acceptable 91/60. The laceration site was packed and dressed. The rise and fall of his chest was steady. He looked smaller in the bed than he had on the gurney. People usually did, once you got the adrenaline of the situation out of the way and saw them for what they actually were. A body working hard to stay alive, stripped of everything that made them seem formidable. She checked the drain output, looked at the secondary monitor for oxygen saturation, and registered that his temp had come up 1/2 degree in the last hour. All of it pointed to the same conclusion. He was stable, and stable was a temporary and precarious thing, and moving him in the next several hours would mean gambling with all of it. She went back the way she'd come. Schultz was on the phone when she reappeared in the alcove. He ended the call before she finished speaking. "He's stable but marginal," she said. "BP is climbing but slowly. If something destabilizes him in transport, a bleed, a pressure drop, you won't have the equipment to manage it. You'd be looking at a second surgical intervention under conditions that won't have what Ochoa has here." Schultz processed this without visible reaction. "What's the threshold? At what point does moving him become survivable regardless?" 4 hours minimum. 6 is better. 8 is what I'd actually recommend." "We probably don't have 8. "I know." He looked at Harriet, who had been typing steadily for the last hour, and looked up now with an expression that suggested she'd already done whatever calculation Schultz was about to ask her to do. "Perimeter options," he said to her. "I've been working on that." She turned the tablet so he could see it. "The facility has 3 external access points that aren't monitored by the internal security desk: loading dock on the south side, the imaging wing side entrance, and the emergency generator access on the north face. If someone wanted to come in without showing up on their camera system, those are the routes. Can we cover them? With what I have right now? No." She said it without apology, the way someone stated a logistical fact. "You, me, and Ms. Vega is not a security team." "There's a man coming," Schultz said, mostly to himself. "He'll be here by 5, Harriet said. "That's what you told me." "It's currently 3:41. Marisol did the math. 80 minutes. "Who's coming?" she said again. This time Schultz answered. "His name is Warren Briggs. He was Rask's commanding officer. He's been in the air since midnight." A beat. "He's bringing 4 people with him." 4 people in 80 minutes, Marisol said. "Yes." She looked at the surgical suite doors, then at Axios, who had woken up when she came back and was sitting upright now, ears tracking between her and the doors in the quiet rhythm of an animal that understood something was happening and was waiting to be told what its job was. The problem with 80 minutes was that it was long enough for a lot to go wrong and short enough that nothing could be properly organized. She'd operated in windows like that before. They were the worst kind. Not short enough to collapse your options down to one obvious choice, not long enough to give you room to breathe and think. "What do you know about who's coming?" she said. "The people who did this to him. Do you have a number? Do you know if they're coordinated or opportunistic?" Schultz's expression shifted in a way she was starting to be able to read, the specific tightening that happened when he was deciding how much to give her. "Schultz." Same flat tone as before. "I'm not asking for the classified version. I'm asking for the version that helps me keep that man alive in the next 80 minutes. 2 to 4 individuals," he said. "Probably not more. This isn't a large operation. It's a targeted one. They had specific information and they moved on it. The fact that Rask got out at all means they didn't have full operational control of the situation." He paused. "But they're resourced. They'll have found out he's here through the same kind of channels we use. So they'll want to confirm, not just assume." "Correct." which means they'll send someone to look first before they commit. She thought it through. You don't come in armed through a hospital's front door unless you have to. Too much exposure, too many witnesses, cameras, variables. Schultz was watching her with the focused stillness of someone who had stopped directing the conversation and started listening to it. So they'll try to confirm through the system first, she continued. Patient intake, insurance records, admitting database. She stopped. Does Rask have a cover identity on file here? The driver gave his name as Marcus Lind when they came in. It's what's in the admitting record. So if someone searches for Theo Rask in this system, nothing comes up. But Marcus Lind is there. Yes? Which doesn't help if they already know he came here. She thought for another moment. If they confirm he's in this building, what's the move? They can't come in hot. Not here. Too public. No, but they can complicate things in other ways. His voice was carefully neutral. Create a situation that requires a patient transfer. Trigger an evacuation. Make the environment unstable enough that moving him becomes the only option, and then control where he ends up. The words landed with a specific kind of weight. She'd heard the concept before, and not in those exact terms, but in briefings about hostile extractions and how they worked. You didn't always need to go in shooting. Sometimes you just needed to make staying more dangerous than leaving. Then that's what we have to prevent, she said, with 3 people in 80 minutes. Yes. She sat with that for about 10 seconds, which was as long as she was willing to spend on the part of the situation she couldn't change. Then she started thinking about the part she could. The admitting database, she said. Can Harriet get into it? Harriet looked up. I can access it. The facility uses a standard hospital management system. Most of them have administrative backdoors for billing auditors. She said it without inflection, like she was discussing the weather. What do you need? Can you create an entry that makes it look like Marcus Lind was transferred, discharged, moved, whatever, something that makes this look like the wrong hospital if someone's searching? Harriet looked at Schultz. Schultz looked at Marisol. I know what it is, she said. Is it better than the alternative? A beat of silence. Do it, Schultz said. Harriet began typing with the particular focus of someone doing something that required precision. Marisol turned to Schultz. The external access points, she said. If I were going to monitor them without a team, I'd put someone where the traffic patterns cross. Not at each individual door, but at the choke points. This building has 2 corridors that everything feeds through. If someone comes in through any of those 3 entries, they end up in one of those corridors within 3 minutes. Where are they? She pulled her phone and opened the mental map she'd built of Cascade Ridge over 2 years of 12-hour shifts, and she walked him through it. He asked 3 questions, all specific, and she answered them. It was the kind of conversation she hadn't had since the Army. Tactical in structure, efficient, stripped of everything that wasn't immediately useful. Harriet finished what she was doing at 4:03. Marcus Lind, admitted at 23:47, discharged via transfer to Delworth Regional Medical at 01:15 due to insurance network requirements. Transfer documentation is in the system. She paused. Delworth Regional is a real facility. It's 40 minutes south. If anyone follows up, it'll buy time, Marisol said. Not a lot, but some. Some is what we have, Schultz said. At 4:19, Axios stood up. It happened without warning. The dog went from lying down to fully upright in one motion, ears forward, body oriented toward the south corridor. The sound in his chest wasn't the questioning noise from earlier. This was something lower and more certain. Marisol was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to move. Someone's in the building, she said quietly. Schultz stepped to the corridor edge and looked without exposing himself. I don't see... Trust the dog. He pulled back, looked at Harriet, who was already on her phone. Then he said, very quietly, to Marisol, options. She thought in a straight line, the way she'd learned to in environments where the time for second-guessing was a luxury you didn't have. Recovery Bay 1 is on the north side of the surgical wing. The south corridor doesn't connect directly to surgical without going through the main nursing station. If someone comes that way, they hit the station first. She paused. I need to get to Rask before they do. You can't move him. I know, but I can be there. She looked at Schult. If someone gets to that bay and sees what's in it, this falls apart. I need to be in that room as a medical presence. It changes what they can do. It was true, and it was also imperfect, and she knew it. She wasn't a nurse anymore in this building, legally, but she had scrubs in her bag because she'd never gotten around to taking her spare set home. And in a dimly lit recovery wing at 4 in the morning, the difference between a terminated trauma nurse and an on-duty one was a set of scrubs and the confidence to walk like you belonged. Go, Schultz said. She went. She changed in the imaging wing bathroom and was through the connecting door in under 4 minutes. Priya was still at the far station, still with her back to the corridor, and didn't look up when Marisol moved through the shadows to Bay 1. Inside the bay, Rask was exactly as she'd left him. Monitors steady, drips running, the slow, hard work of a body pulling itself back from the edge. She put herself in the chair beside the bed and picked up the chart, and she made herself look like she'd been there for a while, which was mostly about posture and the unhurried pace of someone doing routine monitoring rather than hiding in a recovery bay at 4 in the morning, hoping nobody came through the curtain. 5 minutes passed, then 8. At 4:31, she heard footsteps in the recovery wing corridor. Not nursing footsteps. Those had a particular rhythm that came from people who knew where they were going in a space they worked in every day. These were careful, measured. Someone navigating unfamiliar terrain at low speed. She didn't look toward the curtain. She kept her eyes on the chart. The footsteps stopped outside Bay 1. The curtain moved. The man who looked in was wearing a visitor's lanyard, the kind the front desk dispensed between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. It was 4:31 in the morning. The lanyard was either fake or stolen, or this building's front desk staff had a significant procedural problem. He was medium build, dark jacket, and he scanned the bay with eyes that moved to the monitors before they moved to Marisol, which told her everything about what he was actually looking for. She looked up from the chart with the practiced patience of someone mildly inconvenienced by an interruption. Family access isn't permitted in recovery until 6 a.m., she said. You need to wait in the... I'm looking for a patient, he said. His voice was even. Marcus Lind. This patient's name isn't Lind. His eyes moved to the monitors again. BP, heart rate, the labeled drip lines. Looking for something specific. Looking for the profile of a particular injury type, probably. Could I see the chart? He said. No. She kept her voice exactly as pleasant and exactly as firm as a nurse who was used to late-night visitors who didn't follow protocol. You can speak to someone at the nursing station about visiting hours. If you're a family member, they can confirm whether a patient by that name is in this facility. She let a beat pass. Though I can tell you, we had a transfer earlier tonight. If your person isn't in the system, that may be why. Something moved in his expression, fast. He was processing, running a calculation, trying to determine whether what was in front of him matched what he'd expected to find. What kind of transfer? He said. I'm not able to discuss other patients' information. She set the chart down. Nursing station is at the end of the corridor. I really do need to get back to work. He looked at her for 2 more seconds. She held the eye contact without strain, the way she'd learned to hold it in situations where breaking it first meant losing something she couldn't afford to lose. He left. She stayed in the chair and listened to his footsteps go back the way they'd come, and she kept her hands loose in her lap because the alternative was balling them into fists, and then she pulled out her phone and texted Schult 2 words. Bay. Clear. 3 seconds later, her phone vibrated. South exit. On him. She exhaled slowly through her nose and looked at Rask. His monitors hadn't changed. The drips were running. His chest rose and fell with the mechanical patience of sedation. You've got people looking out for you, she said quietly. Not to anyone in particular, just because the room needed a human sound in it. At 4:56, a door opened somewhere in the building and didn't close gently. She heard it from the recovery wing. The controlled slam quality of someone moving fast and not caring about the noise. Then more footsteps, more than 2 people, coming from the direction of the main ER entrance, and they were moving with the specific cadence of people who knew exactly where they were going. Her first thought was threat. Her second thought, arriving almost simultaneously, was that the footsteps were too loud and too direct for someone trying not to be seen. People coming for a compromised operative in a hospital at 5 in the morning didn't come in through the front door sounding like they owned the building. Her phone buzzed. Scholt. He's here. Coming to you. She let out a breath. The man who came through the recovery wing doors 3 minutes later was tall, late 40s, in a civilian jacket that fit him the way civilian jackets fit people who spent most of their time in other kinds of clothing. He had a controlled quality to his movement, efficient, unhurried, even at pace, the gait of someone who had learned to project authority as a habit rather than an effort. Behind him were 4 others, 2 men and 2 women, all in similar civilian dress, all with the same quality of contained purpose. She recognized the type. She'd been around the type. Warren Briggs stopped at the entrance to Bay 1 and looked at Rask. Whatever he'd been preparing himself for during the flight and the drive, the actual sight of Rask in the hospital bed landed differently. She could see it in the 2-second stillness before his expression locked back into professional neutral. Then he looked at her. Vega. You know who I am, she said. Scholt briefed me on the way in. He stepped into the bay, his eyes moving over the monitors with the particular attention of someone who understood what they were reading. How is he? Stable. The next procedure is in... She checked the time. Roughly 36 hours, depending on how the tissue responds. He needs to stay in this facility until then. I know. His voice was flat, not unkind. The person who came through earlier, did they get a good look at him? No, I managed the interaction. They were working off a description, not a photo. I could tell by how they scanned the monitors first. They were looking for injury profile, not face. She paused. The database has him transferred out. It won't hold if they dig, but it gave us the window. Briggs looked at her for a moment with the measuring quality of someone filing information in real time. Whose idea was the database entry? Mine. He said nothing for a beat, then, Where's Scholt? South corridor. He had eyes on your visitor. Briggs turned to one of the 4 people behind him. A woman in her 30s with short hair and the kind of posture that came from a long time carrying equipment on her back. He said something to her in a voice too low to catch, and she nodded and left. What happened in the next 40 minutes was the kind of organized, methodical work that Marisol recognized from a different life. Briggs's 4 people spread through the hospital without making themselves visible, appearing in positions, covering angles, doing it all in civilian clothes with visitor lanyards that were presumably not stolen. Harriet materialized at some point and began coordinating with 2 of them on the camera coverage. Scholt came back from the south corridor with the information that the man who'd visited Bay 1 had left the building and not come back, which meant either the database misdirect had worked or he was repositioning. Nobody seemed certain which. Through all of it, Marisol stayed in Bay 1. Not because Briggs had told her to. He hadn't given her a specific instruction, which she suspected was deliberate. She stayed because it was the right position, because Rask's monitors needed a human set of eyes on them, and because Axios, who Scholt had finally allowed into the recovery wing on Briggs's authority, had settled at the foot of the bed and was doing what he'd been doing since the beginning, staying with his handler, serving the specific purpose he'd been built for. At 5:47, Rask's blood pressure dropped. Not catastrophically. Not the sudden cliff edge drop that meant internal hemorrhage, but from 91 to 78 in the span of 4 minutes, which was fast enough and directional enough to matter. She was on the call button before the second reading finished, and Ochoa was there in 90 seconds, which meant he'd been close. Either he'd been watching the remote monitor or he'd never left the floor. She gave him the readings and the timeline while he checked the drain output and palpated the wound site through the dressing, and she watched his expression do the thing that experienced trauma physicians' expressions did when something was trending in a direction they didn't want. Output's up, he said. Not much, but it's up. Slow bleed, she said. Possibly. He looked at the drips. I'm going to push the volume expander and repeat the CBC. If his hemoglobin's dropped more than 2 points from the last draw, we're looking at going back in. He glanced at her sideways. You're not supposed to be in here. I know. You've been in here for 2 hours. I know that too. He looked at the monitors, then at Rask, then at the dog at the foot of the bed, and whatever he was thinking he kept to himself. I'm going to need the room sterile if this goes surgical. Understood. She stepped out of the bay and into the corridor where Briggs was standing, because Briggs had apparently been in the corridor for a while without her noticing, which said something about his approach to awareness. Problem, she said. I heard. He'd caught enough through the curtain. Options. If he's bleeding, he goes back to surgery. There's no version of that where we don't do it. You can't transport a patient with an active slow bleed. It's a death sentence. She looked at Briggs steadily. This facility needs to become secure enough to allow a surgical procedure. That means whoever your visitor was working for can't get another shot at reaching this floor. Briggs looked at her. He had the particular quality of a man who was used to being the senior person in a room and was doing the internal calibration of deciding how much he trusted someone he'd known for less than an hour. You ran combat medicine, he said. It wasn't a question. Schultz had clearly told him more than she'd realized. 2 deployments, 75th. And you walked away. I did. Why are you still here, in this building? Your job's gone, your badge is gone. Nobody would fault you for... I don't walk away from something I started, she said. It's just not something I do. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he made a decision. She could see it happen, the way you could see decisions happen in people who made them quickly and completely without hedging. I need to make a call, he said. A call that's going to change what the next few hours look like in this facility significantly. Make it, she said. He pulled out his phone, and then he said, not to her, but in a way that made it clear he intended her to hear it. When I make this call, the hospital director is going to find out things he is very much not going to want to know. He dialed. She stood in the corridor outside Bay 1 and listened to Axios breathing steadily on the other side of the curtain, slow and even, the animal version of keeping watch. Down the corridor, a monitor somewhere chirped a routine alert and went quiet. The building was getting closer to shift change. In an hour, the day staff would start arriving, the corridors would fill, the ordinary machinery of a hospital morning would start turning. Briggs said 3 sentences into the phone and then listened for 30 seconds. His jaw tightened once, briefly. He said 2 more sentences and ended the call. He looked at Marisol. 40 minutes, he said. Who's coming? Someone who has the authority to do what I can't do from here. He pocketed his phone. His expression had the particular quality of someone who had just set something in motion that was very large and could not be stopped. Someone Gordon Pruitt is going to wish he never had reason to meet. At 6:03, Ochoa came out of Bay 1 with blood work results. He looked at the numbers. He looked at Marisol. He looked past her at Briggs. And then he did the thing that good doctors did in complicated situations. He addressed the medical reality and left everything else for later. Hemoglobin dropped 2.4, he said. We're going back in. And from somewhere below them, on the ground floor of Cascade Ridge Medical Center, the sound of vehicle doors opening and closing came up through the building's bones. Multiple vehicles, more than 2, the kind of arrival that didn't come quietly because it didn't need to. The sound built from below like weather coming in, not loud, but pervasive, the kind of arrival that changed the pressure of a building without announcing itself. Marisol heard it and recognized it and looked at Briggs, who was already moving toward the stairwell door with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. Stay with him until he's in the OR, Briggs said over his shoulder. She went back through the curtain. Ochoa was adjusting the drip rate and not looking at her, which was a choice. Axios had his head up, ears tracking the distant sounds from below. I need to prep him for transport to the OR, Ochoa said. I need this space cleared of anything that isn't clinical. She understood what he meant and what he didn't mean. I'll be outside the door. That would be appropriate, he said, still not looking at her. She stepped out and stood in the corridor with her back against the wall, 3 feet from the curtain, and listened to Ochoa work. The efficient, quiet efficiency of a surgeon preparing a patient for a second procedure he hadn't planned on. The sounds of someone doing their job at 6 in the morning without the benefit of full resources or full information, doing it well anyway. The vehicles below had stopped. She counted 4 doors, maybe 5. The lobby was 2 floors and a building length away, and she couldn't hear what was happening there, But Schultz appeared from the south stairwell at 6:11 with an expression she was starting to be able to translate, and what it said was, something just shifted, and not slightly. "They're here," he said. "Who specifically?" "NSI Oversight Team, 3 agents, and a woman named Calloway, who I've never met in person, but who carries a designation that means Briggs called further up the chain than I expected." She filed NSY Oversight and Calloway without asking for elaboration because the hallway outside a recovery bay at 6 in the morning wasn't the place for a briefing. Pruitt. Still in his office. He came in early. Apparently someone on the night security staff called him when the vehicles arrived. Schultz's jaw shifted slightly. He's been on the phone since. To who? His attorney, as of 7 minutes ago, which tells me someone already briefed him on what NSSI oversight means for his specific situation. She thought about Pruitt, the way he'd stood in the hallway with his clipboard, the paperwork already filled out, the particular satisfaction of a man who'd made a decision and was committed to it. The attorney call was the sound of that satisfaction curdling. "Harriet," she said, "already with Calloway." Schultz checked his phone. "She's been documenting everything since she arrived. The full timeline, what happened in the ER bay, the chain of decisions, what Pruitt said, and when he said it, the termination." He paused. "Your interaction with the man who came into Bay 1. She wasn't there for that. She had the cameras." Marisol absorbed this. Harriet had been typing for hours, and she'd assumed documentation meant notes, reports, the kind of paper record that mattered later but felt abstract in the moment. She hadn't considered the cameras. "How much did they catch?" she said. "Enough," Schultz said. "The recovery wing cameras are on the external security server, not the internal one. The hospital can't scrub them." At 6:19, they took Rask back to the OR. She watched the gurney go through the double doors, Ochoa at the head, 2 scrub nurses flanking, moving with the compact urgency of people who'd done this before and knew exactly how much time the situation allowed. Axios tracked the gurney with his entire body. Stood up, took 2 steps, stopped when she put her hand on his collar. Not restraining, just present. He looked at the doors and then looked at her, and she held the look steadily. "He's going to be okay," she said. She meant it as a practical medical assessment, not a comfort, and she thought the dog understood the difference because he sat back down beside her and faced the OR doors, and that was that. What happened on the ground floor of Cascade Ridge Medical Center in the next 40 minutes, Marisol only reconstructed afterward from pieces, from what Schultz told her, from what Harriet's documentation showed, from 2 brief things she overheard in the corridor when staff came upstairs with the information spreading the way information spread through any institution, fast and imprecisely and in the wrong order. The woman named Calloway had gone directly to Pruitt's office. Not to the boardroom, not to an administrative conference room, to his office at 6:17 in the morning with 2 NSI agents and Harriet and a folder of documentation that had been compiled over the previous 4 hours. Briggs was not in the room. Briggs was, according to Schultz, specifically not in the room because what was happening in Pruitt's office was not a military matter, and Briggs had the operational clarity to know where his jurisdiction ended. Marisol didn't have the full content of that conversation. What she had were the effects of it, which arrived in sequence. At 6:43, the head of Cascade Ridge's board of directors, a woman named Elspeth Mora, arrived at the hospital. She had not been scheduled to be there. She wore the specific expression of someone who had been called at an unacceptable hour with information that made the hour irrelevant. At 6:51, the hospital's legal counsel appeared behind her. At 7:04, Donna Hecht, the charge nurse who had stood at Pruitt's shoulder the night before with her eyes on the floor, came upstairs to the surgical wing where Marisol was sitting outside the OR, and she stood in the corridor looking at Marisol with the expression of someone trying to decide how to begin a conversation that had no good starting point. "They're asking for you downstairs," Donna said. "Who is?" "The woman from the oversight office." A pause. "And Ms. Mora. Tell them I'll come down when Rask is out of the OR." Donna started to say something and then didn't. She looked at Axios, who was looking at her without hostility, but with the unambiguous clarity of an animal that had categorized her as low priority. Then she said quietly, I should have said something last night. It wasn't an apology exactly. It wasn't enough to be an apology. But it was said to Marisol's face and without hedging, which was more than some people managed. Yes, Marisol said. You should have. Donna left. Ochoa came out of the OR at 7:38. She was on her feet before he was through the doors. Controlled, he said before she could ask. Smaller bleed than I expected. The initial packing had shifted, probably from movement during the night. We re-irrigated, repacked, and closed. He's stable and the outlook is better than it was 2 hours ago. He stopped. Better than it should be, honestly, given what he went through to get here. He walked 7 miles, she said. Ochoa looked at her. That's not something a person should be able to do. No, she said. It isn't. He went back through the doors. She looked at Axios. The dog had relaxed in the specific way he'd relaxed after the first surgery. Not fully down, not fully at ease, but with the particular tension dialed back to something sustainable. Waiting without panic. She crouched beside him and let him put his nose against her jaw, which he did briefly and then pulled back, and it was the most uncomplicated interaction she'd had in the last 8 hours. Okay, she said. Let's go. Downstairs, Gordon Pruitt's office had acquired the quality of a room that had recently held a very serious conversation and not recovered from it. She knew this because she walked past it on the way to the administrative conference room, and the door was open, and Pruitt was inside. But he was not at his desk. He was standing at the window with his back to the door and the posture of a man who had been told something that required him to be vertical to process, but didn't leave room for anything else. His attorney was sitting in one of the chairs looking at a legal pad. He was writing, and he was not writing quickly, which meant he wasn't taking notes on active proceedings. He was writing the way people wrote when they needed to do something with their hands. The conference room held 6 people when Marisol entered: Calloway, Harriet, Elspeth Mora, the hospital's legal counsel, Briggs, and Schultz. There were chairs for more. The untaken chairs had the weight of recent occupancy. Someone had been there and was now gone. And the room still had the temperature of a larger meeting. Calloway was somewhere in her mid-50s, compact, with the kind of unhurried authority that didn't require performance. She looked at Marisol the way Briggs had, the rapid, thorough assessment, and then she gestured to a chair. Sit down, please, Ms. Vega. Marisol sat. Axios settled beside her without being told. I'll be direct, Calloway said. The situation in this building has been fully reviewed, and the documentation supports a specific set of conclusions. I want to go through those with you because several of them concern you directly. Elspeth Mora, across the table, had the expression of a board chair who was several hours into understanding the extent of a problem she had not been informed about when it was still small. First, Calloway said, the patient in your surgical wing. His presence here, his condition, and the circumstances of his arrival are now under NS-WAMWE jurisdiction. The clinical staff who treated him are protected under federal operational security provisions. That includes Dr. Ochoa, the staff who were in the OR, and you. I understand, Marisol said. Second, Calloway opened the folder on the table. The documentation we've reviewed, including security footage from internal and external cameras, the hospital management system records, and witness accounts, shows a clear sequence of events in which the clinical decision to permit a military working animal to remain with its injured handler was medically correct, operationally necessary, and ultimately determinative of the patient's survival. She looked at Marisol. It also shows that the administrator who overrode that decision and terminated the primary clinical responder did so in real time while the patient was in shock. The hospital's legal counsel was writing. Third, Calloway continued, the individual who accessed this facility this morning and entered the post-surgical recovery wing using a fraudulent visitor credential has been identified and is currently in federal custody. A short pause. He was not alone. 2 others were in vehicles outside during the access attempt. They're also in custody. Briggs had said nothing since Marisol entered the room. He was sitting with his arms folded, watching the table rather than the people at it, and she had the sense he was in the same mode she'd been in during parts of the night, letting something run that he'd set in motion and couldn't and shouldn't try to control from here. "What does this mean for Pruitt?" Marisol said. Calloway looked at her with the slight shift of someone who appreciated a direct question. Director Pruitt's decisions last night created a situation in which a federal operative in critical condition was nearly exposed to hostile contact, she said. The fact that the exposure was prevented is not a mitigation of the decisions. The board has been informed of the full sequence. They'll be making an administrative determination today. She paused. "I'd expect it to be swift." Elspeth Morris said, "It will be," without looking up. The hospital's legal counsel stopped writing. Marisol sat with that for a moment. She didn't feel the rush of satisfaction that television and movies suggested you were supposed to feel when something resolved correctly. What she felt was the more complicated thing. The particular exhaustion of a night in which everything had cost something, even the parts that went right. "My termination," she said. "Rescinded," Calloway said. "Effective from the moment of filing. It will not appear in your employment record." She slid a single-page document across the table. "This is confirmation of reinstatement with a classification of, the board's word, not mine, wrongful administrative action, full back pay for the period, return of seniority, and a notation in your personnel file at the hospital's initiative." She let a beat pass. "The board would also like to discuss a formal elevation in your role, but that conversation can wait until you've slept." Marisol looked at the document. She didn't pick it up immediately. She thought about the clipboard Pruitt had been carrying. The paperwork already filled out. The 2 security guards, the particular kind of efficiency that people deployed when they wanted to make a decision irreversible before anyone could question it. She picked up the document. She thought she was done. She wasn't. At 9:14, when she was in the hospital cafeteria with a coffee she hadn't tasted yet, an Axio set her feet because nobody had told her the dog couldn't be in the cafeteria and she hadn't volunteered the information. Schultz sat down across from her. He looked roughly the way she felt. Operational tiredness, the specific variety that came not from physical exertion but from sustained high-stakes attention, the kind that was harder to recover from than a long run because it lived in a different part of the brain. "Briggs wants to speak with you before he leaves," he said. "Okay." "He's not a demonstrative person. I want to set expectations." "I've met people like him before," she said. "I know." He wrapped his hands around his own coffee cup. "I looked up your full file this morning, after you told me to." He said it in a tone that was factual rather than apologetic. 2 deployments, 3 commendations, one of which I'm not able to read the full citation for because of the classification level. She looked at him over her coffee. "Why did you request restricted status?" he said, "when you separated?" She considered not answering. Then she considered that she'd been making that choice for 2 years and it had served its purpose, and something about the last 12 hours had changed the math on it in a way she hadn't fully processed yet. "I had a deployment that ended badly," she said. "Not for me personally, for the team. We lost 2 people and the official record of what happened wasn't accurate. I filed a discrepancy report and was told the report would be reviewed." She paused. "It wasn't reviewed. It was filed. And I was told, professionally and politely, that my future in the regiment would be more productive if I accepted the official record." Schultz said nothing. "I didn't accept it," she said, "but I also wasn't going to fight an institutional wall from inside the institution. So I separated. I requested the restricted status because I didn't want my military record connecting me to that situation in either direction while I rebuilt." She looked at the table. "I became a nurse because it was the most direct translation of the part of the work I'd actually wanted to do in the first place." Schultz was quiet for a moment, then, "The discrepancy report. It's in a file somewhere, under restricted access, with my name on it. We could look at it." She looked up. "Not now," he said, "and not as a favor. But what you're describing, if it's what it sounds like, it's the kind of thing that matters to the people who came into this building this morning." He held her gaze. "It's the kind of thing Calloway's office actually exists to look at." She sat with that. The coffee had gone lukewarm. "That's a different conversation," she said. "Yes," he agreed. "It is. Briggs found her at 9:40 in the corridor outside the surgical wing, where she'd gone back to because the OR doors were where Axios wanted to be, and she'd stopped arguing with the dog's instincts several hours ago. Briggs was exactly as Schultz had described, not demonstrative. He stopped beside her and looked at the OR doors and said nothing for long enough that she understood he was choosing his words the way some people chose their footing on uncertain ground. "Rask wouldn't have made it past the first hour," he said finally, "without what you did with Axios in the bay. Once that dog engaged, there was no moving the team in to work on him." He paused. "I've seen it before. A handler goes down in the field and the dog locks. You cannot break that without harming the animal. What you did took something that most people in that bay didn't have." "It's not a common skill set," she said. "No." He looked at her directly for the first time since he'd arrived in the recovery bay. "I've talked to Calloway. I've talked to Schultz. I know about the report." He said it without preamble. "I know about what happened to your team." She kept her face still. "I'm not going to tell you it should have been handled differently, because that's insufficient, and you already know it. I'm going to tell you that there are people who would want to know who filed that report and what was in it." He paused. "If you want that door open, it can be opened. That's not a promise of outcome, it's a promise of review." She thought about the 2 years she'd spent at Cascade Ridge keeping her head down, the 2 years before that of nursing school, the NCLX, the entry-level job applications, the careful construction of a life in which what she'd been before was tucked away where it couldn't complicate what she was now. She thought about last night, about Axios pressing against her leg in the truck doorway, about Rask's monitors in the dim blue light of Recovery Bay 1, about Pruitt and his clipboard and the specific kind of institutional blindness that cost people something real. "I want the door open," she said. Briggs nodded once. Then he did something she hadn't expected. He extended his hand, not the automatic social handshake of a superior officer acknowledging someone, the specific deliberate handshake of someone offering recognition that meant something. She took it. "Get some sleep," he said. "I mean that practically." He left. She stood in the corridor with Axios and the quiet and the distant hospital sounds, and she let herself feel the full weight of the last 12 hours for about 30 seconds, which was approximately what the moment had earned. Then she stopped feeling it and started organizing it into something she could carry forward, because that was the only way she'd ever known how to move through the world. At 10:06, Gordon Pruitt was escorted from his office. She didn't see it happen. She heard about it from Trevor, the big ER nurse who was afraid of approximately nothing, who came upstairs specifically to tell her, which was its own kind of statement. Elspeth Mora walked in with 2 people from the board and the federal woman and told him to clean out his personal belongings, Trevor said. "Right there. No warning, no prep. Just done." He paused. "Security watched him leave, the same security guys he sent to walk you out." She registered this without comment. "Caroline Voss got pulled into HR an hour ago," he added. "Nobody's seen her come out." The charge nurse, the one who'd stood at Pruitt's shoulder and watched Marisol hand over her badge. "How's the ER running?" Marisol said. "Understaffed and overcrowded, same as always." Trevor looked at her. "You coming back today or—" "I'll be back tomorrow," she said. "Today She stopped. "I'm here for something else right now." He nodded like he understood, which she wasn't sure he did, and he went back downstairs. At 10:41, Theo Rask came out of the OR for the second time. She was there when they wheeled him through the doors. Ochoa was at the front of the gurney, and he looked at her with the expression of someone who had stopped being surprised by her continued presence and arrived at a form of acceptance about it. Rask was sedated, oxygen cannula in place, monitors attached, color better than it had been at any point in the last several hours. Axios came to his feet. They positioned the gurney for transfer to recovery, and as they moved past her, the dog walked alongside it. Not frantic, not surging, just walking in step exactly as he had in the ambulance bay, pressed as close to his handler as the space allowed. Something about the image, the man on the gurney and the dog beside him, had the particular quality of things that were true in a way that superseded the complicated circumstances around them. The dog hadn't left. Through the surgeries and the standoffs and the long hostile night, Axios had stayed with exactly one purpose, and had not been moved from it by anything the building or the people in it had tried. She thought about what Pruitt had said. You chose an animal over hospital policy. She wondered if he'd ever understood what he'd actually been looking at. The orderly who was helping transfer Rask to recovery was a young man named Dio, who had been at Cascade Ridge for 8 months and was still in the stage of the job where he noticed everything. He looked at the dog walking alongside the gurney, and then he looked at Marisol, and he said, "Is that dog? Is he allowed to be?" "Yes," she said. Dio looked like he had more questions. He kept them to himself and kept moving. They settled Rask in Recovery Bay 1 again. Ochoa ran through the post-op assessment, and the drips were adjusted and the monitors confirmed what the OR had shown. Stable, trending upward, the body doing the long, slow work it had to do. Axios found his place at the foot of the bed without being directed. The bay had the particular quiet of a room doing what it was meant to do. Marisol stood just inside the curtain. She was, she realized, running on approximately 90 minutes of broken sleep from before her shift yesterday afternoon and nothing since. Her body had been managing it through adrenaline and purpose, and now both of those things were beginning to ease and the underlying fact of her exhaustion was starting to surface. She was about to step out and find somewhere to sit down when she noticed Rask's hand move. It was small, fingers flexing, the involuntary movement of someone coming up through sedation. His eyes didn't open, but the hand moved and Axios, at the foot of the bed, raised his head with an immediacy that said the dog had been monitoring for exactly this signal. The dog made a sound, low, soft, not a whine, something more specific. An announcement. Rask's fingers moved again, and then slowly, with the effortful imprecision of someone pushing through the thick weight of post-surgical sedation, his eyes opened partway. Not focused, not oriented. The first thing they found was the ceiling, and then they moved slowly until they found the dog. Something happened in his face, not expression exactly, not yet, just the particular shift of a man whose system had been looking for a specific piece of information and had found it. His hand lifted half an inch from the bed. Axios moved up the side of the bed and pressed his nose against that hand, and held it there. Marisol stepped out through the curtain because the moment didn't belong to her, and she knew it, and she stood in the corridor and heard the particular silence of a recovery bay where the right things were happening, and she thought about what Schultz had said about the door being open, and what Briggs had said about review, and what all of it meant for the 2 years of careful, quiet construction she'd been doing before last night dismantled it. She thought about the discrepancy report, the names on it, the incident it described. She thought about the fact that the people who told her to accept the official record had believed that the record would stay closed. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Different from the one Schultz had used. She answered, a voice she didn't recognize, calm, unhurried, with the particular flatness of someone reading from something rather than speaking spontaneously. Ms. Vega, we've been reviewing the restricted file. Your discrepancy report from 18 months post-separation. A pause. We'd like to speak with you about a name in it. She kept her breathing even. Whose name? She said. A pause that lasted exactly long enough to mean something. The name of the person who told you to accept the official record, the voice said, because that person is currently under a separate investigation, and your report is the third document we've found that mentions them. She stood in the corridor with the phone against her ear and let the silence after the voice's last word run for 3 full seconds before she answered. Tell me the name, she said. Another pause. Not hesitation, she'd decided, but the deliberate spacing of someone who understood the weight of what they were handling and wasn't moving through it carelessly. Colonel Desmond Farr, the voice said. Formerly of Special Operations Command, currently in a civilian contractor role with a defense firm called Harwick Strategic Group. A brief stop. You know the name. She knew the name. Farr was the one who'd sat across from her in a room at Fort Benning 18 months after her second deployment and told her, in the kind of language that was technically professional and actually a threat, that her discrepancy report had been reviewed and found to lack sufficient corroborating evidence. and that her future options within the regiment would depend significantly on her ability to recognize when a matter was closed. He'd smiled when he said it. That detail had stayed with her. The smile, not angry, not hostile, just comfortable. The smile of someone who had done this before and expected the same outcome. She'd separated 60 days later. "I know the name," she said. "There are two other individuals who filed reports in the same 18-month period. Different incidents, overlapping chain of command. Both were told the same thing you were told. One of them separated. One is still active and has been carrying it." The voice paused. "Your report is the earliest of the three. It establishes a pattern." She moved to the wall and put her back against it because the corridor suddenly felt like it needed a fixed point. "What does this mean practically?" she said. "It means the investigation that opened 6 weeks ago on a separate matter, I can't specify which, pulled Farr's name from an operational review, and when his record was examined, your report came up alongside the other two. The investigation has been expanded." The voice was careful and precise. "Your testimony, if you're willing to provide it, would constitute a first-hand account of the coercion. It carries significant weight in this context." "I'm willing," she said. She said it without deliberation, because there wasn't any deliberation to do. She'd been willing for 2 years. She'd been willing from the moment she filed the report and had it handed back to her with its implications intact and its facts untouched, sitting in a file under restricted access like something that was being stored rather than handled. "Someone will contact you through secure channels within 48 hours, the voice said. "Until then, please don't discuss the specifics with anyone who isn't already cleared into this conversation." "Understood." The call ended. She stood in the corridor for a moment. The hospital was fully into its morning rhythm now. Day shift well underway, the sounds of it everywhere, carts and voices, and the particular organized chaos of a large medical facility at full capacity. It was the most normal the building had sounded in the last 12 hours, and the normalcy of it was almost strange against the specific weight of what she was carrying. She went back to the cafeteria because she needed to sit down, and because the coffee had been a mistake, and she wanted to try again. Schultz was still there. He had his laptop open and was typing with the focused inefficiency of someone who had been awake too long to type well, but had no choice about stopping. He looked up when she sat down. She told him about the call. Not all of it. Not the specifics she'd been asked to hold, but enough. Farr's name. The pattern. The other two. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Farr. You know him." "By reputation. He's been in contractor space for about 8 months. He closed the laptop. "The firm he's with, Harwick, they've come up in conversations I'm not cleared to tell you about." He met her eyes. "But I can tell you that whatever you filed, whatever those other two filed, if it connects to what I think it connects to, the timing of this investigation is not a coincidence." She thought about that. "The situation that put Rask in that truck," she said slowly. "His partner, the one who didn't make it." Schultz said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. She didn't push it. There were lines of compartmentalization she recognized and respected, not because she'd been told to, but because she understood why they existed and what happened when they were breached carelessly. She'd been on the inside of that architecture long enough to know. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. They sat in the cafeteria for another 20 minutes, not talking much, running on bad coffee and the particular camaraderie of people who had gone through a long, difficult night together and were on the other side of it. At some point, Harriet appeared with a pastry from somewhere and set it on the table between them without comment and sat down and opened her tablet. The three of them occupied the table like people who had earned the right to just be in a room for a few minutes without anything being required of them. It didn't last, but it was something. At 11:50, Marisol went back upstairs. Rask was awake. Not fully. The sedation was still wearing off in layers, and he was in the middle registers of consciousness where things were real but not yet organized. His eyes were open and tracking when she came through the curtain, and they moved to her with the focused effort of someone working against the weight in his own head. Axios was standing at the bedside. Not at the foot anymore. He'd moved up, and his chin was resting on the edge of the mattress near Rask's arm, and Rask's hand was resting against the dog's head with the looseness of someone who had reached for something in a half-conscious state and found it where it was supposed to be. She pulled the chair to the bedside and sat, and she checked his monitors with the automatic attention of someone who couldn't turn that reflex off, even when she wasn't technically on shift. "You're at Cascade Ridge Medical Center," she said, keeping her voice low and even. "In Dunmore, Washington. You've had 2 surgical procedures. You're stable. Axios is with you." His eyes moved to the dog and back to her. His mouth moved. "Don't try to talk yet," she said. "The intubation tube's out, but your throat's going to be sore for a while. Nod if you understand me." He nodded, slow, deliberate, the nod of someone who is working with available resources. "The people who are supposed to know you're here, they know." Briggs was here. She watched his face process that. "Your situation is contained. You're safe in this building." Something eased in the set of his jaw. It wasn't dramatic, just a degree of tension releasing that told her he'd been carrying it even through the sedation, which said something about what his nervous system had been primed for. She gave him a minute. Let him have the quiet and the monitors and the dog. Then he looked at her again, and this time there was more of him in it. More presence. More the particular quality of someone whose brain was starting to do more than just register immediate input. His hand lifted from the dog's head and moved toward her, not reaching but indicating, asking. "Marisol Vega," she said. "I was the nurse on shift when you came in." A pause. "Axios and I had a conversation about what was going to happen. He agreed to let the team work on you." Rask's eyes held on her for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Not enough muscle control for that yet, but the intention of one. She understood it as what it was. Acknowledgement. From a man who had walked 7 miles in the dark with a wound that should have stopped him in the first mile, who had trusted a stranger on a road because the alternative was dying alone in the terrain, who had made it to this room and was now waking up in it with his dog beside him and someone watching his monitors who knew what she was doing. She stayed for another 30 minutes. By the time she left, he was more alert, still weak, still moving carefully through the fog of recovery, but there, answering simple questions with nods and the occasional word, drinking water when the nurse brought it, letting Axios rest his head on the mattress and not moving his hand away. She said goodbye at the curtain, and he looked at her and said hoarse and slow but clear, "Thank you." 2 words. But the way he said them, without the performance of gratitude, without the social inflation that the word usually carried, told her he meant the specific thing, the real thing, the thing that had actually mattered. "Do your physical therapy?" she said. "All of it. Don't skip the boring parts." The intention of a smile again. She left. The news about Gordon Pruitt broke in the way that institutional news always broke in a place like Cascade Ridge. Not in an announcement, not in a memo, but in the specific texture of a building's atmosphere shifting. People knew before they were told because the knowing was in the air, passed in 3-second conversations at the nursing station, in the looks exchanged when someone mentioned his name, in the particular absence of his particular kind of authority from the corridors where it had been felt before. By 2 in the afternoon, it was confirmed and documented. Pruitt had been terminated for cause effective immediately, with the cause cited as administrative misconduct resulting in the endangerment of a patient during a critical intervention. The board's language was careful and institutional, but the specifics in Harriet's documentation, which had been formally entered into the board's record at Calloway's direction, were not careful. They were precise. They named the decisions, the timeline, the consequences of each one, and they named Pruitt as the person who made them with full information about the patient's deteriorating status. It was, she thought, the opposite of what had happened to her discrepancy report. This one wasn't filed and set aside. This one was read. Caroline Voss received a formal written reprimand and was removed from her charge nurse position pending a review that Marisol was told by Trevor with the particular satisfaction of someone who'd watched Voss run the ER floor like a personal fiefdom for 3 years, was expected to result in a demotion that she would have to accept or leave. She accepted it. The leaving would have required courage she'd already demonstrated she didn't have, and at some level everyone in the building understood that and applied it accordingly. The board published a brief external statement that afternoon, careful, unrevealing of specifics, but public, acknowledging that a clinical decision had been wrongfully overridden the previous night, and that the staff member responsible for that decision had been reinstated with full recognition. The statement didn't name Marisol, but the building was small enough that not naming her was a formality. By 3 o'clock, she'd received 14 text messages from coworkers she would not have described as close, which told her something about how quickly a person's perceived status could shift when the official record changed. She didn't respond to most of them. Not out of coldness. She just didn't have the energy for it yet. And she'd learned that there was a difference between the recognition you needed and the recognition other people wanted to give you because it made them feel better about having been absent when it cost something. The recognition that mattered had already happened. It had happened in a recovery bay with a dog and a 2-word sentence and no audience. Everything else was paperwork. She drove home at 4:17. The drive was 20 minutes, and she made it on instinct, the kind of autopilot that her body ran when her conscious mind had been depleted, and she sat in the driveway of her apartment building for a while before going inside. The afternoon was gray and cold and very still. She slept for 11 hours straight, which was the most she'd slept in a single stretch in probably 2 years, and she didn't dream about anything she could remember afterward. 3 weeks later, she gave her testimony. It was conducted in a federal building in Seattle, in a room that was unremarkable in every deliberate way. Plain walls, a long table, water in a glass pitcher, people on the other side of the table who had done this before, and were good at creating an environment where the truth could be said plainly without additional weight on it. She told them about the deployment, about what happened and the official record of what happened, and the gap between those two things. She told them about the room at Fort Benning and Farr's face and the exact words he'd used, which she had rehearsed in her memory enough times that she could produce them without uncertainty. She told them about the 60 days after that, and the nursing boards, and the 2 years at Cascade Ridge, and the restricted status request that had kept the file closed long enough that she'd almost convinced herself the gap didn't need to be addressed. The testimony lasted 4 hours with 2 breaks. The people across the table asked clear questions and did not ask leading ones and did not seem to have a specific answer they were building toward, which she appreciated as both a professional and a person. When it was done, a woman she hadn't spoken to before, older, gray-suited, with the quiet authority of someone whose role in the room was observational, leaned forward and said, "For what it's worth, the other 2 said almost exactly the same things you said, in the same order." Marisol looked at her. "About the words he used?" "About all of it." The woman held her gaze. "That's not nothing." It wasn't nothing. She sat with that on the drive back to Dunmore, the way you sat with something that had been heavy for a long time and had just become slightly less so. Not gone, not resolved into something comfortable, but changed in its weight distribution in a way that made it more possible to carry going forward. Desmond Farr's contractor clearance was suspended pending the investigation's conclusion, which was announced in a federal notice that appeared without fanfare in the kind of publication that most people didn't read, but the people who needed to read it did. His firm issued a statement that used the word unsubstantiated in a sentence that also used the word allegations, and the statement was noted and disregarded by everyone paying attention because the documentation behind it was not unsubstantiated and was not alleged. The investigation was ongoing. That was the nature of these things. They didn't resolve quickly or completely, and she'd known that going in. But the record existed now in a place where it couldn't be filed away. 3 people had said the same things in the same order, and the pattern was on paper, and the paper was in the right hands. That was what she'd wanted from the beginning, not vengeance. Vengeance was a clean concept that real situations never satisfied. What she'd wanted was for the gap between what happened and the official record of what happened to stop being a thing only she was carrying. She was 32 days into her return to Cascade Ridge when she went to see Rask for the last time. He was being discharged. She'd known it was coming. His recovery had been steady, the kind of recovery that was hard-won rather than easy, that involved setbacks and frustrating plateaus and 3 weeks of physical therapy that had clearly cost him more than he let on. But the trajectory had been right from the moment his body decided to stop losing ground, and Ochoa had signed the paperwork that morning. She found him in the room he'd been moved to after the ICU, a regular ward room on the third floor, which was not a pleasant room, but was a room, which meant it was a significant upgrade. He was dressed, sitting on the edge of the bed, working through the discharge paperwork with the particular focused attention of someone who handled bureaucratic documents by reading every line rather than skimming, which she filed away as characteristic. Axios was sitting at his feet. The dog looked the same as he had on the first night and also completely different, relaxed in a way that wasn't inattentive, the particular ease of an animal whose handler was upright and oriented and whole enough. Rask looked up when she came in. He looked like someone who'd been through something and was still in the process of looking like that, thinner than he'd been on the gurney, which said something since the gurney hadn't exactly been his best moment, with the kind of pallor that takes months of outdoor time to undo. But his eyes were clear and the presence in them was the full presence, not the sedation-filtered version she'd seen in the recovery bay. "Vega," he said. "Rask." She sat in the chair by the window. "How's the left side?" "Functional." A pause. "Uncomfortable." "That's on schedule." She looked at the discharge papers. "Ochoa tell you about the restrictions?" "He told me." I told him I understood. He told me he knew I understood and was asking me to follow them anyway. "Smart man." "Yeah." The corner of his mouth, more of a smile now, with actual muscle behind it. "He said the same thing about you, actually." She looked at him. "Said you were in that recovery bay every day for the first week," Rask said. "Not on shift, just there. I was checking your progress." "That's what he said you'd say." He held her gaze with the directness of someone who'd had a long time in a hospital bed to think about things, and had made decisions about which ones he was going to say out loud. "I remember the bay. The first time I came up." He paused. "I remember Axios was there, and I remember someone in the chair." A beat. "I didn't know who, but the being there was, it mattered. More than I would have expected." She sat with that. "You walked 7 miles, she said. 6.4, he said. Briggs corrected me. With that wound. I had motivation." He looked at Axios when he said it. She understood what he meant. Not pride, not minimizing, just the simple statement of a man who had stayed on his feet because something he loved was depending on him to stay on his feet, which was the oldest and most reliable kind of motivation in any species. "I read about the FAR investigation," he said quietly. She looked at him. "I don't have the details," he said. "I'm not read into it, but the name, I've heard the name in a context that I'm not going to elaborate on." He paused. "I just wanted to say that the people who are looking at it, they're the right people. I've worked with some of them." "Schult told me something similar," she said. "Schult is careful about what he says." Rask looked at the window. Outside, the sky was the specific gray-white of a Pacific Northwest morning that might or might not break into something better by afternoon. "I spent a lot of time in this room thinking about what it costs to carry something alone for a long time." He said it without performance, the way people said things they'd arrived at through extended private thought rather than conversation. What it does to the way you move through things, the tightness of it. She didn't say anything because there wasn't anything to add to that. "You kept Axios calm," he said. "You kept him in the building and out of the OR, and you stayed with him for hours, so he wasn't alone when I wasn't able to be there." He held her gaze directly. "For a working dog, that's not a small thing. The separation it's hard on them in ways that have real consequences." "I know," she said. "I know you know." He paused. "That's what I mean." She understood what he was saying, not gratitude for a professional act. He'd said thank you for that already in the recovery bay, with 2 words that meant it. This was something else. The specific acknowledgement of being seen by someone who understood what they were looking at. She'd spent 2 years keeping herself deliberately unseen. The restricted status, the probationary quietness, the careful separation between what she'd been and what she was now. She'd built it all with a specific purpose, and it had served that purpose, and she didn't regret any of it. But she was done with it. Not because of the investigation, not because Pruitt was gone or the board had issued a statement or her personnel file had been corrected. Those things had happened, and they mattered, and they were real, but they weren't the reason. The reason was simpler and more specific. It was Axios pressing his nose against a stranger's palm in a truck doorway because something in his animal understanding recognized someone who knew what they were doing. It was Rask's hand resting against the dog's head through 12 hours of sedation and 2 surgeries and the long, hard night of the body working to stay alive. It was what it had cost her to stand in that ambulance bay and say, "I'll handle the dog." Not the professional cost, not the job that she'd lost and gotten back, but the personal cost of stepping forward in a way that couldn't be taken back, of being visible, of using the things she'd been trying to keep quiet. It had cost her exactly nothing she wasn't willing to spend. She stood up. Rask stood with her, slowly, with the careful movement of someone for whom getting vertical still required attention. And they stood in the room in the gray morning light, and there was nothing particularly cinematic about it, which was fine. Most of the true things weren't. "Take care of him," she said, meaning the dog. "He takes care of me," Rask said. "Both things." He nodded. He extended his hand and she took it, and the handshake was brief and real and contained nothing that wasn't meant. She walked down the corridor and took the stairs to the 2nd floor and came out into the trauma wing, her wing, the place she'd spent 2 years learning to belong to. The ER was exactly as she'd left it 6 hours ago. Organized chaos, understaffed, the specific controlled disorder of a place that kept people alive under conditions that didn't make it easy. Someone had already put a new coffee maker in the break room. Someone had taped a note to her locker that said, "Only welcome back," no signature, and the handwriting was Trevor's. She changed into her scrubs. She clipped her badge to her pocket. She walked into the ER and picked up the first chart, and the morning swallowed her the way a morning does when you know your place in it and you're exactly where you're supposed to be. The thing about being underestimated is that people assume it's only painful. There's no clean version of that, no way to receive it without it costing something. But there's another thing about it that nobody talks about, which is that it gives you uninterrupted time. Time to learn what you know without having to perform it. Time to get very good at things while people look past you. Time to become exactly the person you need to be for the moment that eventually arrives, and every life that comes across yours in that moment. The hospital tried to silence her. The army filed her away. The people who thought they could make her small enough to disappear had very precise and particular ideas about what she was and what she was worth. They were wrong. Not because she fought them. She did, when fighting was what was needed, but mostly because she stayed. She kept doing the work. She kept showing up to the hard thing and applying everything she had to it. And when the moment came that needed exactly what she was ready for it in a way that nobody had seen coming, including her. That's not a story about luck or timing. It's a story about what happens when you refuse to let the smallness of other people's vision become the limit of your own. She picked up the next chart. The doors were already opening again.